Welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion Sessions. I'm Dr. Mikael Thompson, and this is Mr. William Lasseter. We're talking through the introductory material of the Silmarillion and continue our conversation from last episode, or the next stage of our conversation from the last episode, where we discussed the machine, the fall, and mortality, leading up to how do we understand leading up to the Valar and the great sort of theomachy, the cosmic battle of not only the creation, but how does this play out with the different, we essentially amount to the different gods and those beings, the spiritual beings, the powers of the universe, and those who sing in accordance with the great music of Iluvatar and Morgoth, and those who rebel. And who are these gods and what are the gods is the subject of our conversation today. Will, what are some preliminary questions that we might want to ask, or that people might be wondering as we, before we launch into a conversation on the Valar, on the idea of the gods? Are the gods even real? Why are there gods? I thought this wasn't a religious work. What's this about?
A great question to kick off with. I can answer it in less than 2 seconds.
All right.
It's a great question to kick off with. One of the things I think might be helpful is just to quickly recall the argument that we were going through last time that Tolkien seems to raise and others like Martin Heidegger raise, which is that the machine, this complex, an unholy union between technology and human nature, is such that the old gods to some degree have been rendered useless. And Blake pointed this out way back. William Blake pointed this out way back. The old religions, the Christian religion even, has become somewhat hollow in the Western world, and people frequently now are claiming the Christian religion to be the religion that allows them to do all sorts of horrible things. So there seems to be a necessity for making new gods. There seems to be a necessity to create something that revivifies what is an authentic religion versus a sort of artificial machine religion, the gods of the machine, as we were talking about last time. But that does raise a big question. It does raise a big question. How do you make gods? I mean, isn't that a form of blasphemy? Aren't we? I mean, there's only one God, right? I mean, how dare anybody? How dare Tolkien? I mean, how dare anybody set about to make gods? It's a truly audacious experiment, and I think worth addressing.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's an interesting point, because there's one thing then that I think we're faced with two paradigms. One is that there's only one God or no God. There's principles, some basic ideas that are out there in the world today, and you can't just go making gods. It's a delusion to do so, or maybe a nice literary device and all that. So going and putting gods into a universe, in your created world of a story, is maybe fine enough. They're just like other characters. They're all fiction, figments of your imagination. There it is. But let's not go propose it. Let's not go projecting your imagination on the real world that has no gods or has only one god. The other paradigm would be, well, what he's identifying. This is why it's an interesting point that Tolkien himself doesn't use the word gods to describe these beings. But you know what? Most people throughout all of history, throughout history, haven't used the word gods either, because they didn't speak English, and they still don't.
Technical point. Not everybody speaks American.
Actually, not everybody speaks American. So, but it's that. But it's it seems trite, but the reality is we use the word in the parlance of our time. We tend to use the word gods to refer to any number of different kinds of things that people in other places and times may not mean quite the same thing, even if the word they use is a literal translation of the word gods, dei. But the dei of the Romans and the theoi of the Greeks aren't really the same as what we tend to think of them. Yeah, because when you're growing up in that civilization, you're living in that culture, you have a very different perspective. And so when Tolkien uses the word the Valar here and the Maiar, things don't fit really neatly onto our preconceived notions in the modern world of what are gods, what are minor spirits, what are elves, what are fairies, what are all this. it's a much more blurred spectrum, which is actually very close to a lot of traditional cultures and societies, historically and contemporary today. It's much more blurred. Distinctions between, there's not the neat distinction between purely natural material world and spiritual, godlike, divine, something else world, the transcendent, the immanent. And so I think this other paradigm, to get back to that, is that maybe, what if we suspend our sensibilities, our modern sensibilities, and say, it could be the case. So what Tolkien is doing in identifying these Valar and Maiar and whatnot here is that he's simply writing into his story things that also exist in the real world, in the same way that men also exist in the real world and in his fairy tale world.
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, so I would approach this tough question in the following way. You know, I frequently had people come up against things like reading the Greeks or reading the Romans or whatever and say, I just don't believe in a polytheistic system. I don't believe in, as somebody said, I don't believe in this crap. And so therefore they don't need to read it or study it, which is foolishness, you know, because historically speaking, we do, because for many, many generations, people were polytheistic. The trickiness, I think, in our current era, especially in America, probably, is that we've cut ourselves so far off from the original forms of religion that we have a sort of sanitized, homogenized religion, and even a homogenized concept of who the God is. So we have really, as you pointed out, there's atheism, agnosticism, and then there's the belief, as was pretty general before Christianity, I suppose you could say, and in early Christianity. And then there's a literalist belief. So it's like 4 different levels. And you go from atheist, which says, I will not believe in any God. These just don't, they're a total fiction. To the literalist, who believes that there really is a flying grandfather in the sky dressed in pajamas, you know, and it's, you know, it's kind of a broad spectrum in between those different things. But you can say, well, there's agnosticism, and then there's authentic, I suppose, conception of religion, if you will. So atheism says it's a direct refusal to believe in any powers in the world whatsoever. There's nothing in the world that can't be explained by reason and by science, and it's purely machine works. Okay. Agnosticism is, I don't really know, I'm not going to commit because I just have all these doubts, and so I'm just going to kind of hopefully wait until I make a decision. Then you got an authentic religion, which I'll address in a minute, and then you get this literalist belief. The atheist and the literalist, I'm going to cast out for a minute, because atheism, if one proclaims atheism, you throw out any possibility that these thousands of years before you were correct, and you throw out any ability to examine any of the pantheons that we have obviously recorded before us. So atheism puts them all on the shelf as a collective foolishness of mankind, and we're now living in a much more enlightened era. And that it puts you at a very big risk, I think, there to get blindsided. So I'm throwing that one out for a minute. The other end, the literalist, that one is open for ridicule almost, because there is no flying grandfather in the sky dressed in a pajama suit. You know, there's no, like, you might as well believe in the flying spaghetti monster or something, you know, with a noodly appendage. That literalist level is also a failure or a refusal to actually think through what this issue is. So both sides, atheism and the far literalist, they're actually refusing to think about what we mean by gods and what we mean by religion and faith and all that. Then in the middle, you've got agnosticism, which is like they can't make up their minds. And I'm going to put those aside for just a minute, too, because make up your mind, buddy. You know, commit. I mean, my goodness. Either decide you're not going to believe in anything and go that route of sort of non-thinking, or commit to something even if you don't really know for sure, because that's how most people do it. They commit without knowing for sure, right? So now we've got just left as this authentic form of religious thought. Now, into that authentic form of religious thought, we then have either the gods, as we know them, are authentic beings that exist in the world at large and we're recognizing them, or the gods are a manifestation of human perception of the world at large. So this is the nominalist realist debate, is where it really rests. It doesn't rest in atheism, it doesn't rest in literalism. It certainly doesn't rest in agnosticism. You know? I know most of those guys would be like, agnostic? I don't think so. Even if they were just nominalists.
Right.
Nominalism is saying basically that whatever we call religion is a manifestation of human perception of the world, and therefore a very worthy thing to think about and study and look at how we've expressed this thing, and what form has this taken in art and music and song and poetry. And I think, as far as belief systems or ways of looking at the world go, it's a very worthy one, because human perception is a real thing, and we need to take account for how we think as humans.
Mm-hmm.
The other one, which is the realist, says that I find this to be the best position. It's basically the position that says it is human perception, but it's human perception of a reality that exists out there beyond us. I don't control it, I recognize it. And it's there. And whatever it is, I have to express it to another human being. And how do I express it? I express it through art and through song and through words. So the art and words and song that we study in history or in Tolkien is a study of how does the artist express the reality that they have seen in the world. Okay. And then we can agree with whether that reality is a reality or not. I mean, we can say, oh, you got it wrong. This, this God's skin should be blue and not red, whatever. Right. But we're talking about a reality that's being perceived by human beings and isn't just being made up. Okay.
Yeah.
That put aside. How then do humans make gods? We don't make gods.
There's one thing I would interject first, is that in all of those paradigms, there's the post-nominalist world that we live in, the modern West, post-nominalist West, assumption that it has to do with your belief in the existence of something, distinct from a worldview where, well, yeah, the gods exist. Yeah, of course, Apollo's real, and I offer sacrifices to him, don't I? I do things to the gods, and I see effects, either positive or negative, in their relationship with me. We have a relationship together, me and my chosen god that the temple I prefer to go to, or at harvest time, maybe I, petition some other being to bless me and make the crops abundant, or at least ward off the locusts or something. And sometimes it works, sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. But there's no question of whether or not they're real, because it's very practical. You don't question whether your butcher is real. You just, when you want a hock of meat, you go down to the butcher and you buy a hock of meat. When I want a good harvest, I go and I sacrifice, chicken guts to the goddess of the harvest or something, and I know that things work out pretty well for me. And sometimes they don't, and that's usually when either the god is punishing me for doing something wrong. I've broken the contract somehow, or sometimes, this is great. Some of these great stories from history, the gods didn't hold up their end of the bargain, so we're gonna assail the temple and throw rocks at it until they figure it out and start putting things together. I mean, this happens in ancient Rome and ancient Greece.
Whip the Hellespont until it's obedient to my army.
Right. Yeah. There's no question about whether or not they exist. Of course they exist. It's just whether we're getting along at the moment or not. It's a tumultuous relationship sometimes.
Sorry, go ahead. Finish.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I think, that itself should expand our mind. You say, well, your butcher, or pick a thing. Your butcher, or the wild boar that live in the forest that keep tearing up your garden, because that's a problem here. Or the deer, that come, jump over the fence and eat your sunflowers. They're real, and so is your grocer. They're real, and they're in a different category than these other things that you call the gods. I'd say that in many traditional cultures, that distinction of, well, they're of a different order, it doesn't hold. They don't feel that that's a different order.
Yeah. No, I like what you're saying here, and at first I was trying to gather what you were getting about, but I get it. You're talking about these last two, if I will go back to my 4-level model. These last two in the level model. But in the ancient world, very rarely did you have people examining the inner workings of this thing. It just was. It simply wasn't.
Exactly.
You just lived.
Essentially, it was. You wouldn't question whether they exist. You might be angry at one or another of them, and you can pit some of them against others. That's what an atheist was in the classical world, was somebody who upset the gods. Right? You're anti-gods. You have other gods that you worship.
Right.
And they're punishing us now, so we need to get rid of you.
But there was no psychology of the gods at the time. Very little, anyway. I see it in Plato
No,
to some degree. Plato
we
alludes to
do.
the idea that as he calls them, the educated people,
Hmm.
the ones who are enlightened, they
Hmm.
begin to think about the gods as something higher than a physical manifestation or
Right.
you know. So, for instance, go back to my model. The educated person, Plato says, would not say that this god had blue skin and it was cerulean blue, and it was only blue during the day. He wouldn't say that. He would say, well, what does it mean, the blue skin? What does it represent? What does it symbolize? And so
Exactly.
Plato begins to move towards a sort of higher understanding, but at the same time, he's really very reverent of these gods because he knows
Hmm.
they exist. He claims to have seen them to some degree.
Right. That's right. And that's another distinction too, is that a person can, and this is brought up in Plato, um, as well as elsewhere, the notion that the gods exist, one can simultaneously hold, and many educated people in the sort of the higher points of classical Mediterranean civilization do, that very, very, no question the gods exist, but the stories about them may be more or less accurate or made up or fable-ish or, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Um, that they're real, yeah, but the stories about them it's the stories about them that are of a different order than the fact of their existence. In some ways, your theology is different from your religion. The
yeah,
religion is the relationship of cultic practice that you have with these other beings,
right.
and there's a spectrum almost between what we would call the gods and higher level functioning human beings in society. The king, the priest, the mayor of your town, your chieftain. There's this spectrum that also then includes the people who you may be related to.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
and
So
that's
much
an interesting
so.
element too. So there's a lot of overlap
Yep.
between the divine and the material.
So much so that your town's gods or your village's gods could be stolen, could be taken,
Right.
and more frequently were when cities were conquered. And if that's the case,
Hmm.
it wasn't just a sign that your god had been conquered. Your god had been
It
conquered.
literally took your god. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. And you would shed your own blood in order to get your god back.
Right.
So yes, yeah, absolutely. That overlap was one which, for many people, was there was the lines were blurred. There was no distinction between this realm and that realm.
Hmm.
And you see that a lot in Gaelic theology, if you will, Gaelic religion,
Hmm.
because for them, they actually proclaimed that there were certain days of the year where the gods were more manifest than in other days of the year. And
Hmm.
the gods were definitely manifest in certain places more than others. And the earth itself was
Right.
crisscrossed with power lines that the nodal points of which were sacred sites, And
Hmm.
so they were very aware that these gods, whoever we want to depict them, were they're absolutely real. There was nothing psychological about them for
Right. In the sense of merely a projection
yeah,
of
yeah,
my mind onto reality.
yeah.
Now, that's not to say that they can't also be. So I think there's a healthy point in both ends of the authentic category that you identified. I think it's safe to say that there's no reason why we should see a necessary incompatibility with saying these powers of the universe,
Hmm.
whether we call them gods or not. I think the term gods becomes problematic because there's all these connotations loaded into that. But these powers of the universe being things that exist in the real world outside of our own minds, and also being principles, psychological principles within our own psyche. um, I don't think there's not necessarily an incompatibility between these two points of view. I think they're two dimensions of the same thing, especially if we think of the world as a really perfectly intersected space rather than two completely different domains of my subjective experience and the objective outside world. If those two actually really overlap, then there's this mutual interpenetrability between the two,
I
between my
agree.
psyche and the real world.
I agree, and there does seem to be a tendency. Part of what we're arguing about is this question of the machine, and seems to be a tendency in the
Mhm.
machine to look at everything as a machine, and therefore, the
Right.
machine has no soul, and so you have the world, which is this machine-like thing, and you've got some kind of like juice or gas that's poured into it that we call spirit, And that's a very modern way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
There's no tree juice that's poured into the tree to make the machine of the tree operate. There's no
Right.
pure juice that's poured into humans to make humans operate. Contrary to Mary Shelley, who thought it was electricity.
Yeah.
It's really, especially in the ancient world, it was, as you said, an integrated thing between this realm of the what was the word they used, the pneuma, right, and the spirit stuff. There was an interconnection between the pneuma and the physiological. So there's two of the same things. And so when we're seeing these gods, they are, on the one hand, yes, human perception, but also on the other hand, they are also very real, manifest around us.
Right. They're things with agency in the outside world.
Yeah, and their agency has nothing to do with how you perceive it. It just is.
Right.
Just,
it's there whether you see
whether you like it or not. Ares is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
and that's an interesting. So it occurs to me how you define, and this maybe is a good recap of our previous conversation, is that the machine just seems a lot of these distinctions is breaking out. I'm glad you said this. There's kind of this machine thinking. There's the gears, and you pour some spirit vapors into it. It's a machine way of thinking, and that if the machine, as we've been talking about, is, as you I think aptly defined, is a mode of thinking in which mankind, indeed the world, everything in the world, is merely a means to an end, not an end in itself. So everything, including human choice and human flesh, is a resource to be stockpiled and mined for the accumulation of greater power. Then we're talking about just breaking things apart from one thing to the other, in the same way you could disassemble a machine into its gears, and take away its life. Where you say, well, see, when we break it apart, it's really just the gears. There's nothing keeping it going. Therefore, the soul isn't real. It's just an empty phenomenon of matter. The gods are merely your psychological projection on reality, and all that kind of routine, that line of thinking.
Then you get that essence of Gelfling image that we brought up last time of sucking the soul out of your eyes. There's another good image of that in the series Heroes, the first season of Heroes, which is a TV series about superheroes. The main villain is a clockmaker, and he goes around figuring out what the superpower is by basically sawing off people's heads and examining their brain. And he figures out what actually causes the superpower to exist, which is funny, but it's also it's kind of interesting way of looking at it.
There are neurological studies being funded as we speak that essentially aim to do just that, right? They promise they'll put the skull back together, but that's essentially what they do, right? I mean, that's what a lot of neurologists. Where exactly does this or that, even just the level of these when somebody's imagining the color blue, what happens? Where in the brain is blue? And so they're trying to pinpoint that,
Where's that chocolate thing in the brain that will allow you to have the pleasure of eating chocolate without eating chocolate? Where is that?
Right. Where's the chocolate button? Let's find the chocolate gear. When that one spins, we know the person is enjoying chocolate.
And it really is very much an image of Daedalus, I got to say. We talked about Daedalus last time. It's very much an image of Daedalus, thinking everything's a machine. It can be conquered. It can be tinkered with. And then, of course, Daedalus Jr., Icarus, thinks, well, whoopee, I can do anything. I can fly, No, he plummets. But there are two poems that really speak to that. And I think I shared them last time. There was when I heard The Learned Astronomer by Walt Whitman, and then there's also Wordsworth's The World is Too Much With Us. And I don't remember. I think I did share them last time. Did I?
Wordsworth would be good to review that again, because I think we alluded to it without necessarily sharing it directly.
Okay. Yeah, let me draw that up real quick. This is Wordsworth's The World is Too Much With Us, and he's publishing in the 1840s, I want to say. Gosh,
something like that, I think.
And he says, the world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We've given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. So, he's talking about here that our world right now perceives itself as a machine, and it's getting and spending its commerce and sees everything as things to be stored up as potential power later on. So we've given the heart of ourselves away, and it's sordid, it's dirty, it's a gift which is like something shameful about it. And he says all these beautiful things, like the ocean, for instance, the moon, the winds, the flowers, all these gorgeous things don't move us at all because we see them just as machines. The whole life of the world has been sucked out. And then he has that expletive, great God, which, by the way, that's an expletive in that point. It's like, gee darn it, you know, he's cursing at that point because he's so mad about this. And he said, I would rather be, and he refers to the one God here, but he says, I would rather be a pagan than a monotheist, if this is what monotheism leads to. Because then I might have a chance of hearing, the Proteus and Triton, the gods, by the way, who blow horns, which, by the way, we'll get to hopefully in a minute. That's the right thing. Then I might not feel so forlorn. But as it is, I do feel forlorn. I feel abandoned, alone, empty in a world that's seen as a machine, has had the life sucked out of it. It's a very powerful sonnet that he writes. But I think
that is. You go ahead. Go.
I think it embodies what we're talking about here, which is that the modern era kind of like has made a machine out of all this stuff. And where do we go from here? Where do we look for solace? We have to find it somehow in these new gods, because we no longer have, as you mentioned, we no longer have a world where these gods walk among us and are with us and are realities.
And I think that's a key point, is that what if it's the case, and as an anthropologist I can say that I'm convinced professionally that it is a case, as a scholar, is the case, that relationship with gods of some sort or another, whatever you want to call them, I mean, just as a phenomenon of human culture, is part of our human nature. It seems to be that when I survey the wide world and all the peoples that have lived within it, we will replace the gods that have been stolen from us or that we have thrown away. We'll inevitably replace them with other gods. We might think that we're not doing that because if we've been conquered by, so I live in an Etruscan town right now. This was a great Etruscan city, an acropolis. Acropolis with necropoli on the north and south ends at the bottom at one point, and they were conquered by the Romans, and their temples were destroyed and replaced with Roman temples. So the Etruscan gods literally got carried away, carried off and destroyed. And over time, the Roman gods were put in their place. And they no longer worshipped the nuragi, or whatever the term in Etruscan is for their particular kind of the gods of this city. They now worshipped, Jupiter and Mars and whomever, I think locally here, Jupiter and Mars and Minerva. Instead, but you've just replaced the gods one with another, and you say, well, these aren't the Etruscan gods, they're not gods, you have a different term for them, they have a different cult, but in many ways they still kind of embody the same principles in some way or another. And I think that if you've been either conquered or have thrown away your old gods, you determine they don't work, they're not working for you, so you broke up with them, you'll replace them with something else, and you say, well, we don't follow the gods anymore. I worship other things. I have relationships with other things. We may not call them gods. And so if it's this machine world, and the machine has conquered us, or is conquering us, or however you want to think of it, and evacuating the reality of the life that's in it, sucking out the essence of Gelfling from everything that we see, then we may think that there are no more gods, but we've simply replaced them with robots of some sort or another.
Right. Yes, right. Because you brought up this term recognition before, and it's a very interesting point to dwell on for just a sec. Nietzsche says, or in his, I think, Also sprach Zarathustra, thus spoke Zarathustra, God is dead, we have killed him. Okay? And what he means by that is that we have killed the God that we thought we knew. We've killed him, put him in a box, taken the life out of him, et cetera. But I think that it may be that we never did. We didn't actually kill the gods because that's not possible. The ancient world was not creating the gods, it was recognizing powers that exist and recognize them in such a form that when you see the same power expressed in another culture, well, that God is the same as this God. They can be the same God, and you see that in things like the forms of Apollo, because Apollo would take this different, or the forms of Minerva, of Diana, of Artemis, that she takes these different forms, and as cultures assimilate one to the other. There's an interesting theory I read once that the gods in Greece that succeed one another are actually the same sky god. So you start off with a chthonic earth goddess, and the northern invasions of people from the steppes come down and they invade and they conquer and they become the ruling class, the dominant class. But they say your goddess is very important, so she's going to become the wife of our sky god. And they made her the bright lady, which in Greece, the word for bright lady is Hera. So Hera becomes the queen, but she's an older goddess. She's been around for a lot longer. And the new god, Dios takes over. But then there's another invasion from the north, and they conquer, and they say, your older god is very important, but our sky god is the god. So your god can now be the god of the underworld, and it becomes Hadios. And our god is Dios. And then a third invasion comes, apparently, and still marries that Hera goddess. But this god, Zeus, is the god, Zeus. And so he says, your god is important. He can have the sea. He can be Posa Dios. So you got Posa Zeus, you've got Hadios, and you've got Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus. And these guys are now brothers in the much later format of the religion, but they were originally the sky god. The word for the Indo-European word being Zil. And that sky god conquers the chthonic feminine goddess, Hera, and successively you have these gods that overlap because it's the same power, it just has to be relegated to different territories. So that seems to happen as time goes on. I mean, you see this in Egyptian mythology, and this amazing assimilation of different aspects of Egyptian mythology, one after the other, until finally they say, this is the pantheon, and we're closing it, and we're not going to worship anything else. And that sometimes happens too, or the culture gets completely decimated. But one way or the other, the powers that exist don't cease to be powers. They're just recognized in a different way in each successive generation. So when we get down all the way to our modern machine thing, I sometimes wonder, are we say there are no gods, but then we go around worshiping a god of the Palantir, a god of sight, a god of vision, a god of perception, who's really a deceptive god. And he gives us this illusion that somehow we've got perception, but we don't actually have that perception.
Right, because, I have this, and we stroke this, and we attend to this, and we summon things from this. We say summon, that sounds esoteric, but what else are you doing? You're doing that, right? Let's be honest. And you say, well, you don't really believe that this is a god is going to grant you power. I say, well, no, of course not. It's drawing, it's pulling, and then all of a sudden you feel embarrassed. We try to explain how this works. It's pulling energies from the stratosphere that is being channeled through through this set of really weird looking figures that we've put up on the mountaintop over here, these things we call satellite dishes, and and it's pulling right up there. It's it's decoding things from the heavens, because in English you have a convenient distinction between the heavens and the sky.
Yeah.
In Italian, for instance, that doesn't exist. So it's literally pulling signals from heaven down to this and displaying it on here. And so, no, I can throw this away and I can get a new one, and it'll be the same thing. It's just like an old clay idol of the Lares and Penates of my house, that when these start to break down, I replace them, and they're still inhabited by the same immaterial sort of thing.
And they still enhance the same aspect of us, if you will, or pretend to do so. And they just go under different names, and they can be more deceptive and enslaving than earlier gods or goddesses to a certain degree.
It can be, and I think that's true. And I think another distinction that's important is, as we're thinking about, is that we, in the way that we try to simplify, say, what the old Greek gods were like, or what the relationship of the people with them was, we tend to say, well, there was Poseidon, who was the god of the sea, as though he's distinct from the sea. When in reality, he is the sea, or the seas.
That's right.
You know, it's like
That's right.
le maire, c'est moi. You know, Louis the 16th or 14th,
That's
right?
right.
Sun King.
Yeah.
L'état, c'est moi. Le
Yes.
maire, c'est moi. I mean, he is the sea. He's the animating personal agency of the
Right.
waters. And particular waters might have their own subordinate animating agencies, like Old Man Tiber, the river, is also a god of the river. You know, it's one and the same. So there's a personality, and so when we think of things that way, and it's not just like the sun and the moon and the ocean. I mean, Oceanus is a proper name for crying out loud.
Yeah.
But like the tree outside here, or the herd of deer, or the herd of boar that live nearby, are in fact physical manifestations or the physical extensionality of a particular personal agency. We recognize that these things still exist. We just deny that they have a personal animating agency to them.
And I think a lot of that is the lie that we've accepted in the modern world that we have conquered everything. You know, nature has been
Hmm.
the
And
Baconian project.
right, and we still refer to Apple with a proper noun as though it's a thing with an agency, or Microsoft is a thing with agency. Microsoft has come out with a new update and they are inept and crashing my system and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah.
Or the government, the government has said, we apply that same kind of agency to these other things, except in our case, often these machinations. But we're treating these things in the same way, I would argue, that the traditional Egyptian we refer to these things in the same way the traditional ancient Egyptian refers to the gods of Egypt.
And I think, and all this, by the way, I think this is getting back to this whole, what are we doing with the creation of the gods in the Silmarillion? Why is it necessary?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I've noticed is that, okay, monotheism, I think monotheism has superior qualities to a great degree to polytheism. Okay, definitely. But even monotheism in the Jewish culture was not the monotheism we think now. We think there's only one God and nothing else, or everything else is like angels, or everything else is just illusion. So
Right, we believe there's. We think monotheism means you believe there's one God.
right.
Historically, you say monotheism doesn't mean you think that only one God exists, but you just worship one and you say he's higher than the others.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Even early Jewish monotheistic thought that occurred in the 7th century or so was not so much that there are no other gods, but you shall have no other gods before me. You know,
Right.
that Yahweh or Elohim was Hashem was the God, and then all the other
Right.
gods, the powers, were under his ordinance and control, but they were
Hmm.
powers. They were definitely the
The,
powers. You see this in Kabbalistic thought in the Jewish faith. They talk about these powers, you know, the manifestations of the Ein Sof, of
mhm.
Hashem. Uh, so, yeah, you're
And
not,
this is early Christianity as well.
yes,
Let's
it
not forget,
is.
why is it so
Yeah.
wrong to worship the pagan gods? Because they're real.
Yeah.
Why is it a big deal to go into the temple and throw down the statue? Because you're claiming that Jesus Christ has now conquered that real God.
Yep.
It's not to say like, well, we just should stop believing that he exists and we'll become more enlightened. That's just not historically how things developed.
No, I was reading somewhere a really good article in that whole transitional period that occurred there in early Christianity. And the folks that tore down the temples and defaced the temples and burned the libraries and temples have gotten a lot of heat. And some of it, I think, is rightly so, because you destroy all that stuff and, you know, it takes generations to recover it. But what were they doing? They wouldn't have done all that had they thought that these things were not real. They wouldn't have done these things if they thought, well, there's only one God and only one Jesus Christ and all that stuff is just hooey. They were very aware that these other powers had power over the earth, and that they saw them as enslaving powers that had to be
Mm-hmm.
conquered by the new thing, the new God.
Right.
And that explains why they were so vehement. Many of them were so vehement in destroying the old temples and the old figures and the old herms. And there's a lot in the ancient world, and we now tend to gloss over a lot of the awful stuff that occurred in these old polytheistic religions. It, like excoriation in the Mesoamerica, you know, or
Mm-hmm.
the cult of Hermes and the Herms that existed outside of every house in Greece. or the caste system that occurred in Egypt. You have these things
Right.
horrendous, but they wouldn't have been considered horrendous except for the dawn of this new deity, the dawn of this new recognition that occurred with the Jesus.
Right.
So really, when we talk about any gods, whether it's in Tolkien's work or whether it's in Greece or Rome or Egypt, we have to consider how these people actually thought and what's being done with the gods. And for that matter, what do these gods actually represent as different from this other set of recognized powers? Okay, and so like on that score, I was thinking the other day of the gods of Cthulhu of H.P. Lovecraft.
Okay.
It's pop culture for sure.
Yeah.
But Lovecraft was a modern. He was a 19th century modern, and he was recognizing something horrendous in his own culture. And what he was recognizing was that under this veneer of science and respectability and Victorian primness, there were these deep, violent, horrible, dark gods that he saw. And honestly, the powers, whatever they are, if we don't recognize them, they come back as nightmares. Okay? They affect us as nightmares. I don't remember the psychological term, you might yourself, but I think it was it repression of those things rather than it's repression versus something else, which is like
sublimation.
Sublimation, yeah. That's the word I'm looking for. And when that is done, when we say these things don't exist or they're not real, they don't stop being real. They just become nightmares.
Exactly, because bottling something up, I mean, sort of psychologically pushing something down and trying to stick it in the closet, as it were, is only like putting the lid on a boiling pot. Eventually, the pressure is going to build up and it's going to explode and come out sideways. Rather than sublimation, which is essentially putting things in their proper order, putting this thing that's bent out of whack back back in the proper place on a hierarchy, so that it can find its legitimate expression, its sort of healthy flow of things and all that. That's a healthy way to do it. If you simply say, and sort of exteriorizing that now to the outside world, outside of merely the human subjectivity, but in the objective world, if the gods are real, if these powers exist, right, these other forces in the universe are there, these principles of reality, whatever you want to call them, if they're real and you simply continue to deny the reality, that comes out sideways. And one way that manifests is you end up enslaving yourself to those very powers that you vehemently deny exist through their incarnation in a new form, in this case we've been talking the mechanistic form.
Right. And that brings, just a technical term here that I was noodling and I put in the notes here. Real, authentic religion, if we call it that, is a recognition of the powers that be, and machine gods are a fabrication, a lie, a creating of a false god that challenges nature to force nature to bring out its resources. Okay, so the challenging, the German word herausfordern, that's the false making of gods, and we set them up thinking, well, this will dupe people, and they'll buy our product or whatever it is. The Greek word for actual creation, especially creation of God images, was sometimes poiesis, but they also had another word, which is kataskenasma, and that has in it kata, the word kata, and the word skena. Okay, we say scene, a scene. So a kataskenasma was really something coming out from behind this. On the stage, this wall that the actor stood
popping
behind.
out of the legs there,
exactly.
Out of the wings.
In authentic religion, what we're doing is we are creating images that show what's behind the wall, behind the veil, what's behind the veil of our visual and material world, and it has a real existence there. And so we make it, or poiesis, we poeticize it by using time-honored images and time-honored representations. And then this allows the creation, if you will, of real gods, of a pantheon that's an authentic pantheon. But it's not
Right. So
creation that's not just out of nothing. It's not an ex nihilo. It's a creation that's a
yeah,
recognition and a use of time-honored techniques.
giving a face to something that's
Yeah,
real and there versus fabricating a corrupted imitation or
that's
something.
right. Right, right. And
Or
so,
in fabricating an alternative, it ends up necessarily being a corruption.
yes, absolutely. In
Just putting
fabricating an
people through that.
alternative, it becomes a corruption of the original. Yeah, because it I think one could say to some degree that in fabricating, what you do is you still recognize that there's a reality, but a psychologist will talk. You probably know more than I on this. Psychologists talk about a shadow self and a real self.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is a Jungian thing, but nevertheless, a shadow self and a real self. So all these images have a good side and a bad side. It
Right.
also goes back to Jewish thought, has this too, the shadow self.
Yeah. In fact,
So
it's
if you're fabricating that thing in the wrong way, if you're lying, if you're twisting and making a machine gun, machine god, then you're creating actually the shadow self of a real god, and that means enslavement
yes.
and corruption.
Yes.
And that means, to some degree, artists that depict these stories have there's a great weight on them, great responsibility on them to do it right.
Mm-hmm.
To make the thing in the right way rather than in the wrong way, to not use their art to manipulate and seduce and impress, but rather to use their artwork in order to embody or to reveal or to inspire others.
Yeah. Yeah, because you embody or you reveal, and I think both. You embody insofar as you reveal some deeper principle of reality as an artist, whether
Right.
that's a painter, a sculptor, a filmographer, an author. You can reveal something, or you can give the same shape but do it in a different way.
Right.
And it is exactly right. You end up creating the shadow version of it, which is dangerous as well
Uh,
as perverse.
so I don't think the objection, like people may object to, say, Harry Potter, or they may object to C.J. Cherry, or they may object to Ursula Le Guin,
Hmm.
or they may object to Tolkien, or any other number of science fiction and fantasy writers, or what's his name, Frank Herbert. They may object to
Hmm.
them because they're making false gods. But really, what's going on is the fear is not this creation of a pantheon. The fear should be a creation of a pantheon that works to enslave the mind and works to
Hmm.
seduce the mind rather than reveal something of reality. And I think this is
Hmm.
why people are so in love with Tolkien and don't have a problem with his pantheon in Silmarillion or elsewhere. It's because there's an almost intuitive recognition that what Tolkien's doing is he's recognizing something that's already there. He's just giving it a face.
Exactly. And in fact, I think, as we'll see when we go through the Silmarillion, it's in many ways an illustration through narrative of this same principle of
Yeah.
what happens when you really reveal the powers that are there in their true form, and what happens when you begin to twist that reality to make a shadow self. I mean, that's the conflict between Morgoth and the other, or Melkor, Morgoth, and the other Valar, and then that's the conflict in Numenor with Sauron versus the elves, and we see that real self, the light self, and the shadow version contrast, that duality played again and again throughout, and of course it's right on through the Lord of the Rings as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I share? Reminds me of this great letter by Pope Benedict
Hmm.
XVI. There's this great letter that he wrote to artists, and this is back in the what's it, the 2000, yeah, early 2000s, right? And he wrote this great letter, which I think really captures this image of what an artist is doing, especially an artist when they're doing religious work of all kinds, religious imagery. This is the address to artists by Pope Benedict XVI, and he wrote, "The profound bond between beauty and hope was the essential content of the evocative message that Paul VI addressed to artists at the conclusion of the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, the 8th of December 1965. And Paul said, 'To all of you,' he proclaimed solemnly, 'the Church of the Council declares through our lips, if you are friends of true art, you are our friends.' And he added, 'This world in which we live needs beauty in order not to sink into despair. Beauty, like truth, brings joy to the human heart, and is that precious fruit which resists the erosion of time, which unites generations and enables them to be one in admiration. And all this through the work of your hands. Remember that you are custodians of beauty in the world.'" I like that, custodians of beauty. And then Benedict goes on, he says, an essential function of genuine beauty, as emphasized by Plato, is that it gives man a healthy shock. It draws him out of himself, wrenches him away from resignation and from being content with the humdrum. It even makes him suffer, piercing him like a dart. But in so doing, it reawakens him, opening afresh the eyes of his heart and mind, giving him wings, carrying him aloft. It's a great observation, I think, by the part of Benedict, is that art does this thing where it kind of draws you up, shocks you. Splash of cold water in the face. And there's that great sculpture. And I'm trying to remember which saint it is. I'm blanking. But it's got the little angel with the arrow, and he's piercing her, and she's back in ecstasy. And is it the
Yes, Bernini's. Yeah, exactly. Bernini's Baroque marble sculpture, the ecstasy, Saint Teresa in ecstasy.
That's what
the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Yeah, it shows her in flagrante delictu, essentially, as this angel is got a brass or gold arrow in his hand, piercing her heart. Yeah. And of course, the angel is a total replica of a classical model of Cupid, right?
Right, because the
or Eros, right?
Of Eros, yeah, right. Because the religious experience is similar to the artistic experience, which is similar.
Yes.
One has to say, to some degree, it's similar to the erotic.
It is creative. It is. Yeah.
So artwork has this job to do, and it does so through the various forms, and has done so for generations through the various forms of religious expression and otherwise, until recently.
So with that, then, what is Tolkien doing in his art here with the gods? Who are the gods? Who is? So we've got a couple of different, let's not even call them ranks, we've got different levels of reality, I suppose, different levels of being that we're talking about. There's Eru Ilúvatar, the one who's got two names. There are the Valar and the Maiar. Who are these? Should we go through some of them?
I think absolutely. And I was thinking especially of the initial gods, it would be important to just take a look at them and really have a more deep dive into the passages there in the Silmarillion. The first one that we have to begin with is Eru Ilúvatar.
Right, Eru, the one.
Yeah, the one. Right. I mean, you mentioned he has two names. Why two names? It's a really important thing to notice. First off, it echoes the two names of God that are in the Old Testament. You've got El Shaddai and Hashem, and those exist and numerous other names of God, but there are two main names that appear in the Old Testament over and over again, of Elohim and Yahweh. Yahweh is the Tetragrammaton, and it's a very sacred name.
Right.
They would say Jehovah because they would actually put in the aspirated parts in order not to say the Tetragrammaton. And then you had Elohim, who is God.
Right. Or gods. It's plural.
Yeah, God's plural. Yeah, it's the core.
That's the interesting part. They referred in the plural to a singular to encapsulate all these.
Right. And things,
but
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and here you've got Eru, which just means one. It's the closest approximation to the syllables that in many languages refers to one or singleness.
Right. And then the elves, he says, in the language of the elves, his name is Ilúvatar. His name is
yes.
It's an interesting thing. I heard a recording where the announcer pronounced it as Ilúvatar. Ilúvatar.
Oh.
And I don't know if I like that.
I don't like it.
It's wrong. It's wrong, but he was emphasizing the fact that word is similar to father.
Exactly, okay. and that's intentional on Tolkien's part.
Right.
There should be a resonance to that, a familiarity to Ilúvatar.
Yeah.
The one father, the great father, the all father, something like this. Right. That's not wrong. That makes good sense. Right.
So this God he's the illuminating father. He's the father that makes light. Okay. And by the way, for those who are pop culture fans, there seems to be a similar thing in Star Wars. The initial Star Wars Episode 4, the only one that counts. The Darth Vader, apparently,
Yeah.
seems to be taken from the idea of the Dark Father, the
The
shadow
Dark Father.
father. Okay, the
So if
Dark
it took
Father.
you till episode 6 to realize that Vader's his father,
Yeah,
you don't speak German.
yeah, no. Right. But that image has come down to us, the image of the Father, and it raises the question: why do we culturally refer to the God as Father, and why have we referred to the divine being as a masculine divine Father being for eons? And is there any legitimacy to the idea that there was a culture in which the supreme being was a mother, a great mother? See, there's a lot of talk now about how there was a shift historically from the great mother to a father that dominated and took over and was evidence of a patriarchy conquering.
Yeah, and I don't know that that holds up to all the historical scrutiny. There's a lot of competing there's a lot of mythos competition in the early 20th century to retro project either sort of a pro-Proto-Aryan and an anti-Proto-Aryan, among academics, right? There's these competing things that are playing out in like sort of real time ideologies of the early to mid 20th century that influence the stories that historians and anthropologists tell
Right.
about ancient history.
Yes. And much of that mother stuff has been supported by, on the one hand, the discovery of these Venus dolls, as they're
Hmm.
called, these little round, probably pregnant things of
Hmm.
clay that have been found all over Neolithic sites. And the other,
Right,
the presence of holy cave temples that go miles deep into the earth.
right.
And they make the assumption that this represents the birth canal and the world of the womb. So there's something.
So,
Sorry.
so does a traditional Gothic church.
Yes, yes,
It
it
does
does.
actually.
It does, and that's an interesting point because the fact that it does not mean that there was a matriarchy.
Not at all.
Yeah, it does
It's
mean
about the
there's
church being, the church is feminine, God is still
yep,
seen as masculine, and the church gives birth to many children, the
yep,
prayers throughout,
yep.
the church
A,
and her children.
a recognition of a fact rather than the
Hmm.
twisting to whatever we want as the fact. The recognition
Right,
of
right. You don't
this,
have to go Elaine Pagels and Dan Brown to
I know.
understand correctly some of the
This is like
symbolism that's there.
heresy. It's the patriarchy. No, I mean, it seems highly unlikely to me that very, 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 very ancient people, Neolithic people and beyond, that they would have had a societal structure where women were buff and beat up their men and dragged them around by the hair and told their men to do this and that. That seems really contrary to everything we know about human beings as human beings.
It would be an anomaly in the animal world
Very.
of the simian
Animal,
type.
yep, it would indeed. It would indeed. Um,
Now,
now,
that said, that's not to say there weren't nations of Amazons. Absolutely not.
yeah, what it does seem to indicate is that there were these recognitions of powers that were maternal. And
Hmm.
there were even cults of
Hmm.
maternal goddesses. Uh,
Sure.
Thesmophoria Zeusai in Greece, for instance.
Hmm.
Celebration of all that was and was not female. Um, but the problem is that those cults, they were highly problematic. They recognized something that was terrifying. They recognized something that was the dark shadow self as well as the positive light self. And the
Hmm.
dark shadow self was this all-consuming nature, this desire to devour, this desire to mother, this desire to consume all. Um,
And order things according to this. So there's this bit we just look forward development of Galadriel's personality and character in what's coming. There's some really
yes,
good stuff in there. That's where Tolkien really drives it all out
yes,
in
yes, it
different
does.
manuscript traditions, as though he were actually different cultures. He's got different
Ah,
versions of what Galadriel, who she was, her backstory, how she came to be, how her personality and character developed, and it's fascinating things to look forward to on that very point.
yes, and I have some good Anglo-Saxon texts to bring up when we do that. The Saxons were very aware of this. I mean, Anglo-Saxons were misogynistic. They didn't hate women. What they recognized was that when a woman goes bad, it's worse than when a man goes bad. That's what they wrote over and over again. I mean, the terror of the land was not Grendel. It was Grendel's dam. You
Yeah.
know, it was that feminine power that goes dark, and I think the most ancient cultures, even the more rationalistic ones like Egypt, they recognize that when this power goes bad, it is far worse than when the male power goes bad. The shadow self of the feminine is far more dangerous than the shadow self of the masculine. So into that world that offered the possibility of a chasm, a chaos, a dark,
Hmm.
all-consuming pit, you have a God who is about light and rational thought and life and the giving of order and form to things. Well, that God was traditionally associated with what's called masculine powers. And the ancient world saw men and women as a manifestation of this, but the masculine and feminine were not men and women. It was masculine.
Exactly. They're higher and they're up here,
Yeah,
and individuated sex in creatures is one of the many expressions of
right.
these higher principles, rather than the point of view that somehow, well, human beings as men and women exist and they project these extreme forms of masculinism and feminism onto into higher powers. Because if you think about things in that way, you tend to misread the actual way that society is structured and how they relate to one another.
And has been structured for thousands of years.
Exactly. If, on the other hand, you can see with their eyes that there's these cosmic principles that are much higher and much broader than any particular biological or gender role expression, then we can start to understand. Then we're not going to come into it with a very skewed lens.
The idea being that the masculine powers and the feminine powers both had a light side and a shadow self. So
Exactly.
it wasn't like if we're all masculine all the time, things are going to be great. That was
Not at all.
proven wrong completely when you look at the playwrights of the classical Greece, and you have the story of the Bacchae.
Hmm.
Pentheus, the Bacchae, is attempted to be all masculine. I mean, he's really buff, dude, and he's going to make everything right by force of his arm, and it doesn't quite go that way.
It doesn't work out well.
Quite the opposite. But what they're recognizing there is that attempt on the masculine, the shadow self of the masculine, is
Mhm.
to order things by force and by law and by yelling and by breaking stuff. And that's how the shadow self of the masculine works. So you've got the light side of the masculine, which is order, reason, and structure, and giving of life by putting it in its place. And then you
Mhm.
get the shadow self of the masculine, which is trying to overdo it and pave the earth, so to speak.
Right.
Nuka gay whale for Christ. That's the shadow self of the masculine. Then you get the light side of the
Right.
feminine.
So,
So just to finish that thought, the light side of
mhm,
the
mhm.
feminine is nurturing and contemplation and magic and mystery and beauty and the making of a home and the hearth. That's all the light side. The dark side of the feminine is to consume everything and devour it in all chaotic darkness. So which one is better, so to speak?
Mhm.
It's
Yeah,
almost
no,
like it's
absolutely.
almost
You've
like they have
got,
to work together. They have to work
yeah,
together.
that's right. That's right. And that is, we see this in the Ents too. I was just reading recently Lord of the Rings again, and the story of the Ents and the Ent wives, they embody these two different kinds of
Mhm.
principles in their positive form with some minor flaws each, without being totally corrupted.
Mhm.
And there's some other development of where ogres, trolls, that was it, where trolls come from, and all of that might. There's dissertation matter to be written in how their origin and where things may have gone awry with that. But yeah, these two principles, we see them first really illustrated among some of the different Valar then,
Yep.
or these Ainur who. So the Valar, what I should just say is the Valar are the Ainur who have opted to enter into the material, the physical, both material and spiritual, physical created world, and not remain solely in the celestial court
Right.
of God.
Right. So if I could read that passage,
Hmm.
um, this is from the Valaquenta, and share that passage here to dwell on it for just a
Hmm.
second. First off, notice that Iluvatar is the keeper of the secret fire. That's where all light and fire and life begins. It emerges from him. And he basically then has a court of Ainur, many, and only some go down into the world. So there's a larger court than what we actually see in the Valar. But it says, then those of the Ainur who desired it arose and entered into the world at the beginning of time, and it was their task to achieve it, and by their labors to fulfill the vision which they had seen. Long they labored in the regions of Ea, which are vast beyond the thoughts of elves and men, until in the time appointed was made Arda, the kingdom of earth. Then they put on the raiment of earth and descended into it and dwelt therein. There's a lot there. I mean, that's, Arda is the kingdom of earth. The regions of Ea are the regions of the whole of creation. These Ainur go down and they put on raiment of earth, not human form necessarily, but raiment of earth, and they dwell then in the world.
Right. And he somewhere speaks of them as being, sometimes they're masculine and feminine.
Yes.
They're not male or female. And these forms, these raiments, these garments that they put on to become visible to creatures with eyes and whatnot, when that needs to happen later on, are not their physical form.
Right.
In the sense that, in the same way you and I have a physical form of a body,
right.
They're more like the clothing that you and I take on and off, and we still remain, whether or not we're wearing our, our sport coat or sweater.
Yeah. Okay. So that's important to note, because their raiment is something that allows us, the beings of Arda, to see them, right? But that's not them. Their actual real essence, if you will, is a divine essence, which is not male or female. It's not male or female. It's it's divine.
Yes.
But it has a manifestation, or it has aspects that align it with the masculine or the feminine power. This is, again, I think he was very familiar with Jewish thought, it seems, and he even wrote, he even told Hitler where to get off, because Hitler was like, you want to come write a big Nazi epic for us? And Tolkien's like, thanks, no. And Hitler says something about, are you Jewish? And he says, no, I'm not part of that excellent race, so steeped and learned in knowledge. So it's obvious that Tolkien was aware of Jewish thought to some degree. So in the Jewish thought, there is the Ein Sof, which is the infinite light, the realm of infinite light, and it's neither masculine nor feminine. But the first manifestation of God, for lack of a better word, the first manifestation of the Ein Sof is in these two forms of Ayin and Yesh, and that's Ayin and Yesh are sort of equivalent to nothingness and something. Ayin is nothingness and Yesh is something. But is more really equivalent to feminine and masculine than it is anything else. It's nothingness, or the feminine, like the moon on the still ocean, if you will. And then Yesh is something like a rock on a bright, warm day is more like it. Okay? So it is, I mean, something and nothing doesn't quite get the idea of Ayin and Yesh, I think. But out of Ayin is where things emerge, right? But they emerge, and Yesh is the thing that gives them form. So it manifests them. So it's like out of the womb, out of the feminine comes the stuff, but the stuff is in the world of the rational, masculine Yesh world. So I guess what I'm getting at here is the Jews saw, like many ancient cultures, that the creation of things happens in a dual aspect, a masculine and feminine aspect. But these masculine and feminine powers were just that. They were powers. They weren't men and women. They were nothingness, something. And the interplay of nothingness and something was important for the creation of things. I mean, okay, sorry to go off on this.
If I can just jump in, it sounds esoteric, everybody. But when you think about it, they're forces. Gravity is a force, right? It's like this order of things, and we need the interplay. Even in modern materialistic metaphysics, they believe in a masculine power and a feminine power at the smallest atomic level. It's what a proton and a neutron, or proton and electron are, or vice versa, electron and a proton are. And there needs to be a nothing in between them for them to circulate around each other to make things happen. So the same principle, the same explanation is offered, just with different terminology. Anyway.
Exactly, different terminology. Okay, so I just was reading about this the other day again, that there's always been a problem with how does a God who is infinite and all-powerful, how does he create individual things? So what's the relationship, Plato said, between the universal and the particular? Well, in the Jewish faith, there's this mysterious thing that happens where God hollows out an empty spot in himself. You know, I'm not one to explain what that means, but this hollowing out, called Tzimtzum in Jewish thought, was the beginning of creation. It wasn't, we think that the beginning of creation is God said, let there be light, from Genesis, from Genesis in Greek, beginnings. It's not. The actual beginning of creation in Jewish thought is there's God, and he hollows out an empty space in himself, and that space is without form and void, and darkness moves on the face of the waters in that space. So that space, that emptiness, that hollowness is like the moon, if you will, over a still ocean. And in other places, it says that's wisdom. Wisdom is that hollow space. And into that hollow space, then God projects the masculine thing of light. And so you have God, one, then you have God in the empty space, that's two, and then you have this third thing that emerges, and that's the creation, and that's three. But then the creation has to be defined, and so it's defined by four. And four is north, south, east, west. It's the perception in four dimensions, if you will, of north, south, east, west. And every ancient culture seems to have had a similar progression into created existence. And they talked about these four God things, points, as though they were divinities or gods. So, for instance, in
well, of course, these become real. I get it. Again, I know, I'm just getting excited following along with you. Yeah.
So in Egyptian, they have what's called the Ogdoad. Okay, and the Ogdoad were 8 powers, but they were 4 sets, if you will, masculine, feminine sets.
4 doubled.
4 doubles, exactly. So I guess you could say that the hollowing out, the Tzimtzum, the creation of the empty space is repeated a second time, and then a third time, and then a fourth time. You could say that, I suppose. But that Ogdoad, then, the 4 sets, was then pinnacled or capstoned by the first creator God, which made the Ennead, the 9 powers that be in Egyptian thought. You have a similar thing here, although he, I think, has his powers as being 14, like 7 sets, I think. But he has a similar thing. We can talk about what that means, 7 in a minute.
Yeah.
He has a similar thing, masculine, feminine. They're sets.
Yep, you've got Aule and Yavanna, you've got
exactly.
Valarda and Manwe, and so on, yeah.
And those sets then are the ones that make up the created world through their singing, their choirs, but then through their immediate action in the world itself. Okay.
Yeah.
So I find it fascinating. This is something which all these ancient cultures seem to have had. You had the, in the Norse, you had the Aesir, and then later the Vanir, and you had other instances of this in Greek thought or in Babylonian thought. So you had all these ancient cultures that had a similar idea that from the unity of the power, you have this division into sets, 4 sets, 12, or whatever it was.
And then sometimes those that are subdivided, there's a revolution in which that hollowing out happens again. Yeah.
So
that's cool.
Tolkien is not out of his element when he does this, but what he does do, which is fascinating, is he says, okay, each one of these characters is another manifestation of Iluvatar and his love for the world. This is not creation of bad God and then another bad God and then another bad God.
Right, and I think that's important at the outset too. In people who've grown up in a Christian or post-Christian society, they may tend to modern Christian, which we intimated before. The machine has infected religions in the modern world too, and that's all I'll say about that for right now. But it's a different view than, say, the 8th century person would hold, or the modern Syriac Christian would hold. Is very different from modern Western post-Christian thought. But Where was I? It's right. We should not think of see the Silmarillion and the Valar is not God and then these other creatures that fell away from him and they're all demons. No, but rather they are, as you said, they're manifestations in the world, in Ea, of Iluvatar's own love for that creation, while also themselves being creatures with their own personalities and their own agency. In the same way, we might think of, if we expand sort of our understanding of what angels are, angelic type powers in the universe, in the cosmos.
Huh. Yeah, the word angel, we call them angelic, which is a Greek word, angelos. It
Which just means messenger.
describes, yeah, exactly. It describes their office. It doesn't describe their nature.
Exactly. It's not the species of thing they are, it's one
What
function
they
that they
do.
might carry out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like, say Bob the postman. Well, postman is not Bob's essence. It's just the job he does.
right.
So when we talk about angels, we're talking about angeloi, and all of there are 9 different ranks in the Christian thing, and those
Hmm.
are all angels. They're all messengers, but it's like seraphim and cherubim and powers and principalities.
And when we start at the bottom and work our way up to we think angel, the most base of my guardian angel, and then we just think of cherubim and seraphim as somehow more important versions of the same thing, species. It's just the
Yeah,
bigger
no,
ones or something.
no,
No, no, no, no.
they're
We're talking about
radically different.
flaming balls of fire with
Yeah,
eyes and wings,
yeah.
and lion face, eagle face, man face, bull. Straight, it gets weird, right?
Yes,
It
it does.
gets things you've never seen on any trip you've taken.
You mean to like Topeka or something? I'm sure.
For
Uh,
example,
uh,
yeah,
there's a great video that
or
actually,
Sedona.
or so yeah, right, exactly. There's a person who he uses modern computer technology in order to recreate digitally what the angels actually would have looked like given tradition, and it's really they're pretty darn terrifying. The first word out of most of the angels' mouths: "Be not afraid." Well, why would I be? Oh my
Oh my
good.
God.
Uh, they're not
Right,
sweet characters in nightshirts with eagle wings.
right. And the beautiful thing is we get to see all of that, and I think Tolkien has just really done a masterful job in describing the Valar in their different forms, in their different activities, and how they interact with one another. And I know we're coming up to the end of our time on our episode
Yeah, right.
here, and then we'll have to get into, and I think this is a good segue. In the next episode, let's talk about each one of the different Valar, and that introduces their relationships to one another, and that moves right into the first chapter of the Silmarillion proper,
Yes.
where we see them fully begin to play out those interactions. And just to preface it, what we see is the act of the creation of the physical world through the interaction of these different forces and different elements. And because we know that creation happened in the Great Symphony, that's the Ainulindale, but now we're looking at it, the same event, from a different lens, from within the picture instead of from over the shoulder of the artist.
When we look at it, the last thought on this here, when we look at it, it's very important to note 2 things. One is the manner of creation and the manner that the gods deal
Hmm.
with the created world makes a huge difference in what kind of story we're telling. You go back to those Cthulhu gods.
Exactly.
Cthulhu gods not only don't care about humans. If they do come up with humans, they're going to eat them. That's what their whole relationship is to humanity. So it says something about how do you view the world. The other thing is the auspices of the gods. That is, what do they actually oversee? And I want to look at that next time we meet about what does Manwë actually oversee? What does Elbereth actually oversee? Because what the gods
Hmm.
oversee, that is their auspice, that has a huge effect on how we view things around us. It makes a huge difference, and it makes a huge difference on how the story unfolds, and it also makes a huge difference, I got to say, in having a properly ordered hierarchy. Uh,
Hmm.
and that's one of the big things I think we're going to see when we see the Silmarils.
Yes.
When your hierarchy gets out of order, and you think that
Hmm.
this god is more important than he actually is or she actually is, you're in for a bad time. You're in for
Right.
trouble. And whether that's a Silmaril or whether that's hashish or whether that is romantic love, when that thing becomes out of place, look out.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we see the inversion of some of these principles and how chaos ensues from that.
Absolutely. Good. Well, thank you. This has been good.
Thank you, Mr. Mr. This is very good.
Yeah. And I suppose we'll end again with the aquilic salutation. Dr. Thompson, farewell wherever you fare, till your Ares receive you at the journey's end.
And Mr. Lasseter, may the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.